Okay, all right, live stream is live. Welcome everyone to Bible study. If you are watching on the internet, I don't know if you are watching on the internet, but if you are, welcome. Just tossing it out there into the internet. Okay. I can chat with you if you make a comment, though. I will see it, so... All right, well, let's get going. So we have a couple announcements. First of all, there is more food, so if you want more food, please go get more food. Second of all, I don't know if you noticed, but we are currently painting the sanctuary / gym, the sacred gym, like I like to call it. And so that means that choir practice tonight will be in here, which means we can't go over like we normally do. So we're going to be ending promptly at 7:30, maybe even 7:25. So that's really good for me because it'll keep me on track. And if I could get any of y'all's help putting away tables, although I need to confirm if we actually need to have these out by tonight, because if there's nothing going on in the morning, we can always just clean them up tomorrow. So I'll let you know about that. Hopefully Jennifer comes in here sometime so I can ask her. So let's get started, shall we? And to the people on the stream, if you can't hear me, please let me know, because I don't know if you can hear me or not. Sometimes I have a helper helping me, and today I don't, so hopefully I'm not too distracted. We have established our deacon of the microphone. Everyone, let's give a hand to our deacon of the microphone tonight, Mr. Jure.
Thank you so much.
You're truly a blessing in so many ways. We also have Clorox today because we want to keep the mic clean. So don't be afraid of talking to that mic. And as per our reminder, August's theme at On-Ramps this month is Once for All. And in Bible study, if you're a child or if you are a youth, which is also still technically a child because you're not an adult, I guess. I don't know. If you're a student, I'm a student. So that's confusing. If you're going with Jessica or Miss Yada, now is that time. So grab your stuff and enjoy. Hope you have a great time. So Once for All is our theme for August. We're in Hebrews chapter 9. And I want to just say, by way of our, recap, we've been in Hebrews all year. And Hebrews is an amazingly complex book because it's speaking to people in a cultural context that's just so different from ours. Even though we read the Hebrew scriptures, like we don't really know them. That's what I'm learning, is that we don't really understand how they understood the Hebrew scriptures to the extent that is helpful for reading Hebrews a lot of the time. So when we're talking about once for all, this is talking about the establishment of the new covenant and how the new covenant is based in Jesus. And covenant is also something that we have a hard time understanding. All of that stuff, it's just confusing. So if you've been following along this year, I'm really happy. I hope you're learning as much as I am being part of this. But we started off this month talking about, what did we talk about? Who was here last week? Who wants to say what we did last week? I do remember, but... Yes, we talked about mediators. Great choice. Great choice. Great answer. Great choice to answer. Thank you. Yes. So we talked about mediators, but we had to kind of establish, why does God, or at least, why does God relate to us via mediators? I think today we tend to think God could just appear to each of us in a personal way in our hearts, why do mediation? And so that's a great question, right? But where is that? Oh, yeah, see, these are not ordered very well. We're continuing to talk about mediators. Why do we need mediators? What are mediators for? What are mediators? How do they factor into the book of Hebrews? So we talked about what kind of like philosophy of religion. We talked about last week what are the different kind of conceptual categories for different kinds of ways of thinking about the divine. And so we broke it down basically into two macro categories. And we even said too that, like, you know, the way that people put different religions into these categories are sometimes really wrong, because like you can think that different mythological stories like mean different things. So some people will read them very literally, like, oh, this, you know, guy, this magic guy that lives on top of a cloud, his name is Jupiter, and one time he became a dolphin and then, you know, had kids. Or one time this one god came out of the forehead of another god, like, I don't remember who that was, one of the Greek ones. So you can take those really literally, or you could be like a philosopher in the ancient times and you could say, whoa, what if these mythological stories are allegories about like the true divine world, where maybe there's like one great creator, or maybe some sort of like eternal universe with these sort of different co-eternal forces that have to be in balance. So there's all kinds of different ways of conceptualizing like the divine realm, right? So knowing the differences is really important, I think, just because it helps us just kind of know what religions are about. Like, I think we tend to be like kind of tribal, and we'll just say, well, I'm Christian, so I know that one's right, and I know all the other ones are wrong. But like, we don't think about like how they're different. We just know. I just know that mine is right, and that makes the other ones wrong. And so like understanding them is not important, but really you learn a lot about what Christianity believes when you can compare it to other ways of thinking about the world. I think there's a lot of benefit to deeply knowing like other religious traditions, so that you can just, I don't know, it's just good to know. And it's not like a thing that's scary, like, oh, you'll become like another faith, or you're going to lose your faith in Jesus. Like, I think it's an act of faith to, be curious about the world. I think the lack of curiosity about like the way that other people believe about the world, I think is sometimes rooted in fear that if I were to encounter a different way of thinking, then I would realize that it was right and I was wrong. And I think people like the comfort of believing they're right more than searching for the truth. And so I think as Christians, we should be the most open. If we have trust that the one God that created everything in the world has been revealed by Jesus, then every truth out there is God's and is good. And so we shouldn't be afraid of truth in whatever form. And there's a lot of things that aren't truth that, say that they're truth. Everything says that it's truth, And so that's not to say it's not complicated, like we'll just know what's what. But I think we can't have a posture of defensiveness or fear, because we can be led astray by that just as easily, if not more easily, than we can be led astray by, false teaching, or by, like harmful things from other faiths. So does that make sense to you all? What do you? I'm curious what you think about this. We can just have a conversation, But yeah. Let's move on. But yeah, like always, if you have a comment, jump in, like now.
Yeah, I agree with.
If you press the button, it'll turn on. Yeah, just tap that
Is
middle
it
button.
on now?
Yeah, there you go.
Okay.
Yeah.
I agree with what you're saying of just like the fear to explore, to find out like oh no, maybe my belief is wrong. Because I remember a time where I also had a similar experience. I was scared to take a class because of that reason. And I ended up taking it still. And I think learning more actually brought me closer to Jesus, or even like felt like it grounded me more in my faith. And so that exploration can be like the opposite of what we expect. And it is like super important to, I'm in agreement from personal experience.
Oh, cool. Thank you. So I think that's like general. I think like be curious. I don't know. It's easy for me to say I'm a 7 on the Enneagram, so like I am motivated by curiosity about the world. That's like a deep underlying motivation for me. So it's easy for me to say be curious about the world, right? But I feel like I've seen like the best aspects of it and the dangers of it too. But like, I guess I'm just an advocate for being curious about the world. If God is who God says God is, then we should not be afraid to explore everything. Like, and trust that the Holy Spirit will guide us in that, and that we're going to be led towards truth if we trust the Holy Spirit and we stay connected to God. And I think if we stay in community too, because a lot of times, I mean, again, we were talking about the internet earlier. Like, I think a lot of times we acquire our beliefs really abstractly because we just do it by ourselves on the internet. And like, if you're just sitting alone on the internet, you can get into lots of weird corners, and you can start to like convince yourself of like all kinds of stuff. So speaking of things that you love to study, I don't know. I love studying QAnon. I was talking to my dad about this earlier today. I think that stuff. I think it's not like I like exploring those. I like studying like the sociological phenomenon and like how do people sort of like absorb and start to live into this like huge like cultish sort of like mythological world, you know? And it reminds me that like if you're motivated to believe something, you can do it. Like motivated reasoning is real. Hi, welcome. And hi, it's good to see you too. Motivated reasoning is real. Like if we have a strong desire to believe something, we can make ourselves do it. And so that's like a good reminder. And when I see people that I'm just like, wow, that's some wild stuff there, I think it's interesting, and especially it's like challenging because I'm like, I'm not a different kind of person than the people who believe that stuff. So it's not like I'm incapable of being fooled in that way too, or like fooling myself. So, yeah, I don't know. Study, learn about cults. Like, it's interesting. It's really interesting. There's a lot of good Netflix documentaries about cults. Like the Nexium one is really interesting. I don't know. There's a bunch. But yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
But it is very interesting because, some things, these stories are, it always comes to mind, like, okay, nobody just simply made all this up, made all the stories. There has to be some, and I believe, this is my own personal opinion, I believe some of what we see in Old Testament, especially early parts of Old Testament, that it may speak to some of that, and some things that I've kind of read and stuff, discovered. It's kind of like, okay, there's some things, obviously it's not the true God, but the way, we understand is people telling stories about what they possibly experienced and say.
Yeah.
And, their interpretations of it. But I look at something. I even enjoy looking at different signs, areas. Like I said, I'm not into it in the sense of, do it, I believe it. But we can be churchy and spiritual all we want to.
Right.
In reality, that stuff is spot on. It's spot about your personal it's spot on most times. So then you want to look, okay, how is it spot on? How could that have happened?
Yeah.
So then that speaks to how we're made,
Yeah, just staying curious. It's important. I think sometimes, so like we said, yeah, staying curious is like healthy, and I think it has to do with, yeah, like we said, fear of the outside. So I think a lot of Christians sometimes fall into this trap where they think like, okay, I'm scared of the world around me, but how about this? I know I can stay safe if I just stick with things that are like Christian things. Like if I stay within the Christian subculture, I know I'll be safe. I won't have to think about my consumption choices. I'll just stay with whatever they sell at Berean or whatever, you know? And honestly, like that's actually pretty dangerous in itself there. Because if we just think like, well, the things that call themselves Christian, they're safe. The things that don't are unsafe and of the world. We're going to miss out on a lot of really like God-honoring truths that exists out there in the world, and we're going to absorb some garbage stuff that calls itself Christian. So the lines aren't between like the Christian culture and the non-Christian culture, as if that's where like God's truth is here and the outside is bad. It just doesn't work that way. And I think people adopt that like attitude, I think, because it's easier than critically discerning the things as we come across them. We just think, okay, if it's on this side of the if it's on this side of the Berean, then it's good. I don't even know if Berean's still around. You remember those? No, Berean was like a Bible store. I'm using it as a stand-in for Christian culture in general, you know, but it might not be around. That's fine. We'll say Hobby Lobby. I don't know. But yeah, if we do that, we will miss. We'll be susceptible to false teaching that calls itself Christian, because we'll have our defenses down because it's like, oh well, it's got a cross on it, it must be good. And we will also be totally undiscerning. We'll block out the ways that God wants to teach us from things that don't call themselves Christian. And this last month, we just talked about hospitality, receiving strangers, and then the way that God would use those on the outside of our community to speak to us personally sometimes, or to bring us a message that we would not receive otherwise. So I think it's an inhospitable move to like block out everything in your life that's like not explicitly calls itself Christian, and we might be missing the blessing of God by not being curious and looking for the truth that's there. But like I said, it's hard. Like discernment's not easy, which is why a lot of people skip it and just let someone else discern for them by just staying within like a subculture. But yeah, that was a tangent. That was totally not connected. We're talking about different ways of thinking about God, right? So I broke it into these two. We said polytheism is many gods. Monotheism means one God. But we said what makes Christianity is monotheism, but not because it only believes in one God only. So monotheism is more about the story about the one God than just how many gods do you believe in. If you were to take like like Greek mythology and then just murder all the gods and leave one, you wouldn't be left with monotheism. Like that's not you can't negate your way to monotheism, right? There's a categorical difference between the idea of the one creator God and the mythologies about all these different gods. And we're going to get into that a little bit more later, but we talked about that some last week. And so, yeah, let's talk about what makes God God in like a monotheistic. So I think the starting point for the Christian and the monotheistic view of God is creation. So what makes God God and not like a small g God is that God is the creator of everything. And in Hebrews, we have Hebrews 1, there's a great passage that speaks about this, right? It says, in the past, God spoke to our ancestors through the prophets at many times and in various ways. Oh, those are mediators. Oh, what? Look, first verse of Hebrews, and we're already talking about mediators. But in these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son. And now we're going to hear about the Son, whom he appointed the heir of all things, and through whom he made the universe. It says the Son is the radiance of God's glory and the exact representation of his being, sustaining all things by his powerful word. I love that passage. I think it's awesome. After he provided purification for sins, he sat down at the right hand of the Majesty in heaven, so that he became much superior to the angels, as the name he's inherited is superior to theirs. So here we see the first example of God, or of the author of Hebrews, like talking about mediators and also contrasting Jesus to other kinds of mediators, being the prophets and also the angels. So the prophets are people who speak on behalf of God, so that's a mediation, right? Because you have to get the message that God wants to send into a human mind and then through human lips and then into other human ears. Like, we're already mediating 3 or 4 times over there, you know? And then it says that he's higher than angels, right? So angels, we remember the word angel in Hebrew and Greek means messenger. So it sometimes referred to divine beings that were sent by God to minister to people and to bring messages. But it also could be used more loosely as like anybody who is acting on behalf of God to bring a message. So in that sense, you could even refer to prophets as like angels, not in the proper term angel, but like what it means as messengers. So the Bible plays with that ambiguity sometimes. That's why we always say, like, I think hospitality and angels is not always that you're literally going to be hosting a divine being, but maybe you're going to be hosting someone that God wants to use to give you a God-inspired message, you know? So don't always be looking for halos on people, like when you're offering hospitality. That's not the payoff necessarily. The payoff is that God wants to, like, bless you in some way if you open the door through hospitality. So that's just an example. But we're saying what makes the Christian conception of God is, I think, stems from creation. When you look at the mythologies of other mythological, canons, a lot of times it will be like, okay, there are these 12 gods, and they are doing, and then here's stories about their, the things that they're doing, right? Their exploits. It never asks the question, like, who made those gods? Where did they come from? Like, a lot of times, a lot of religions, they're just not interested in the idea, like, they haven't conceptually, like, asked the question, why is there something rather than nothing? And that's the question of creation. Even the people who argue about, the creation, like, does the Big Bang prove that God exists? That's not even really, like, the essence of creation. Creation is like the being of everything, and it's like, why is that? What is the cause of that there is anything rather than nothing, right? That's what we mean by creation. And that means that whatever created everything has to be categorically different than everything that exists, because everything that exists is on this side of that creation, right? And then that means that God is like wholly other. God is like a different kind of thing entirely than anything that we can see and touch and perceive. Unlike the gods, the small g gods, who, although they were more powerful than humans, sometimes they could move around, they could change forms. They were doing that to trick people all the time, becoming animals or other people. They're still contingent created beings. They're like they're divine, they're heavenly beings, but they are within this world, and they are subject to forces like time. They are subject to the fate, like the gods in Greek mythology, like, could not escape fate. So then what the heck is fate? Is fate God? Like, so Greek philosophers eventually started asking these questions and rethinking, like, we have to go all the way back and think, like, what caused the gods to exist? Like, why are the gods there? Like, who are they serving, And these are the questions that would eventually get people to think monotheistically, right? And this is something that I think God revealed to Christianity and Judaism and Islam, like, they believe the idea that, like, you can know most about God by God actually telling you. You can reason your way to, like, a coherent conception of what God must be kind of like, but you can't, like, prove God's existence, because, like, God is transcendent. So, what is God? I think we have to say, first and foremost, God, capital G God, is the creator of everything that exists, right? I should look at my notes. Any questions? How are y'all doing? Yeah. Well, and that's, we live in a world that, like, takes for granted the Christian story, but I mean, in other places they might call Christianity mythology and whatever their dominant religion is. It's more of a pejorative, I think. And, like, scholars of religion will talk a lot about Bible stories and say, like, these fall into the genre of mythology. And they don't mean it in, like, a negative sense, like mythology means stories that aren't true. It's, like, actually a genre. And so, I mean, that's a whole other thing. We don't have to talk about that right now. But, like, so some people use it that way. But really, the big thing is religions that think about the creation of everything, they think about why is there something rather than nothing, instead of just, like, how can I appease the forces of nature to make my life go a little better? That's the interaction with the gods. It's usually like, because the gods are usually personifications of certain aspects of nature or of culture. So the god of war, if you want to do well in your battle, pray to the god of war. The god of fertility or harvest, the god of the home, the god of the ocean. Like, if you're a sea traveler, the ocean is really scary. So if there's, like, a spirit or being that can give you a little competitive edge on the ocean, you want to do that, right? But God, the God of the Bible, is defined by the fact that God is the creator of everything. And so, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Creation is where we get the first hint that God of the Bible must be different than the gods of the other stories, right? God is like a different kind of thing entirely. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. So what do y'all think? Like, what is it about? So I'm saying creation. The creation is what sets the idea of God apart from small g gods. Does anybody have any, like, thoughts about why that might be? What is it about creation that makes God different? And this is not just me saying this. Like, this is all Christian philosophers from the beginning of time. Like, not the beginning of time. Like, the beginning of philosophical thinking about Christianity, I guess. Chris, go ahead. I'll summarize for you if you want. Yeah, let's grab the mic. Yeah.
I believe one of the things, like you were mentioning, the mythologies, all of the mythologies, we talk about Norse mythology, Egyptian mythology, Greek mythology, all of those that were considered gods came from somewhere. Zeus, Hades, Poseidon, all them, they all came from Kronos, yep. And they all had an origin.
Mm-hmm. That's good.
And so when God, he separates himself, he has no origin. People of time, like such as we are, it's hard for us to contemplate, to even imagine that something without an origin, because everything that exists within our world has an origin.
Right.
But he is the origin.
So an uncaused thing is like just in a different category altogether than anything that we can see or perceive around us, right? So it's like a different category of of existence. Deja, let's deacon of the mic. Let's bring.
I think I feel like I also only have like Greek mythology and whatnot to reference because I'm less familiar with other polytheistic religions. But I think too, like you were mentioning, the personification of things within the world, like they kind of just end up being like rulers over something specific, whereas God like created that thing. And so thinking about creation is like, God's like, I don't need to rule over it because I made it. Like, I know how it works. I know how it runs. I am the one who put it into existence. And so kind of that difference.
That's a great example. Like, so what you're saying is God has a different relationship to the world than any of the other gods, because the small g gods are fully within the world. They're like an actor within, on the stage, right? But the creator, like, either made the stage or like is the stage in a sense, you know? So that's like a totally different kind of thing. So even though they both have the word God, well, at that point we're talking about completely different things. And that's why I wanted to like keep harping on this. So I think sometimes we think of like the Christian God as like a small g God, but like bigger than all the other small g gods, like the biggest small g God that could exist. And when what we're saying is that like the conception of God like goes much beyond that in really important ways. We should mature in our understanding of like what God is, just in the same way that we mature in our relationship with God, like knowing who God is in like an interpersonal way. I think it's important that we develop our idea and our conception of what God is. I think mostly so that we don't commit idolatry. Because, so think about it, like God, unlike the gods, Yahweh was like, you cannot make an image of me. And that was for one reason, because human beings are the image of God. And so God wanted to say like dedicate your devotion, like the devotion that you want to give to an idol, give that to your neighbor. And that's how you worship God, by like loving your neighbor, by doing justice, by loving mercy. But also because God is the kind of thing that categorically cannot be depicted by any image made by humans. And so I think it's a cool image, the idea of like this beautiful, huge temple, right? So it's not like they weren't making like religious objects, right? They were making these huge ornate temple, and you would walk inside, and if you were the priest, you would walk into the Holy of Holies, and you would see this beautiful room, and in the middle of the room is this throne on top of the Ark of the Covenant, right? There's this throne, and it's got the winged cherubim, but sitting in the throne is nothing. It's an empty throne. And I just think that that's like amazing like religious sensibility, that like if it's God, it's not even something that we can depict. Like it's recognizing the ways that as humans we are incapable of depicting God truthfully because we are humans. Like we're finite beings that were made by this God. And so the hubris that we could possibly depict God into an image is almost insulting, you know? And so it would be fine, like other gods don't mind having statues of them because like we know Zeus is a guy with a thunderbolt and he's got a beard, like, you know? And maybe some people would be like, well, that's a metaphor. But like there was no religious observance against depicting Zeus because Zeus was like, the concept of Zeus was not as high as like the concept of God. So you were saying you only know Greek mythology. We're going to look at another mythological thing, and it's closer to the culture of the Hebrew Scriptures. What the heck? Where'd my cool picture go? Ah. Well, hold on. I want you to see this. It was too good, I guess. Let me try to refresh this. Yeah, let's go. All right. Boom. Okay. So this is the Babylonian creation story here. Well, okay, this is a depiction. There's a book called the Enuma Elish. That's it. That's what it looks like in Akkadian, in cuneiform. This is a creation story very similar to the Genesis creation story, but also very different in very important ways. In this creation story, again, there are gods. There's multiple gods. No one tells us how they got there. No one tells us where, basically like chaos exists before the creation of everything, but chaos is like, what is that? And where did these beings come from? And ultimately, Enlil and Marduk battle this Tiamat, this goddess that represents chaos, and also the sea. The Akkadian word for this goddess and the word for sea are actually really similar. This is a theme that happens in the Hebrew scriptures too. The chaos of is personified by the ocean in many ways. If you read the Psalms, it says, God. It always talks about God like, what is the word, like subduing the waters, or putting fences around the waters, like marking off its boundaries. This is God controlling and subduing chaos. But in the Babylonian story, chaos was basically like the most powerful god, and Enlil and Marduk fight this god, and they slay it, right? And when they slay it, this is a text from Enuma Elish. It says, the Lord Enlil stood upon Tiamat's hinder parts. Wait for the kids to leave. And with his merciless club, he smashed her skull. He cut through the channels of her blood and made the north wind bear it away to the secret places. And what happens is Marduk and Enlil slay Tiamat, the dragon of chaos, and like decapitates it, and then its body parts sort of fall, and that's the creation story, is these one god's murdering this other god, and like its body becomes the world that we know. So that's the creation story. Very different, right? These gods didn't just speak creation into existence. They defeated other beings that already existed. No one knows where they came from, and that's how the world got to be. So it's pretty obvious that we're talking about fundamentally different orders of like being. Because, as we remember, it's a lot easier for Yahweh. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. He didn't have to do any slaying. There was nothing to slay. There was only God. And God, out of pure generosity, made everything that exists. That's like, so even though the stories have like superficial similarities, I think it's important to recognize if we didn't know Enuma Elish, and like biblical scholars do, this is the context that Genesis was written in, or these were the stories that were popular at the time. And what do they tell us about the world, right? They say the world is fundamentally chaotic, and it's only acts of violence by powerful beings that can put the world into order. That's the worldview of this story. It's telling you what's like the most real about creation. Genesis, on the other hand, is a totally different story. It's a story that says the world is a gift from an all-powerful Father, like the giver of life, decided to gift everything that exists out of pure generosity and hospitality. Like God made a space to create people just so that he could love them. He didn't make them. So in Enuma Elish, the creation of humans is basically to be slaves for these gods that win this battle. So, Marduk and Enlil and these other gods, they basically make people to be servants. That's very different from Genesis. Also, there's a flood story in Enuma Elish, and basically the gods, it says that the gods are trying to sleep up in the heavens, and the humans that they made were just so loud, like they wouldn't shut up. And so the gods basically decided to flood the world to destroy them because they were really annoyed. So there's just like these, even though the narrative structure is similar because the genre is similar, the theological story that Genesis is telling is totally different than the one that Enuma Elish is telling. And it's positing a totally different order of God. So I hope that makes sense. Creation out of nothing is a big deal. It's what kind of separates the monotheistic God, like we said. Here's a couple of quotes, but I don't know if... Basically, if we want to account for the being of the world, God is causally responsible for the existence of everything. Also, this is another thing. This is Brian Davies. He's a cool philosopher of religion. But he says, it's actually God's transcendence that allows us to think about God as being close to us all the time. So last week we talked about how God's transcendence means that God is absolutely different from us, right? And absolutely beyond us. But at the same time, that God's boundlessness, God's transcendence, is the very thing that allows us to say that God is close to each and every one of us all the time simultaneously. God is everywhere since he is making everything that exists to be what it is from the inside, as it were. So the act of creation too, so sometimes people mistake what people say that God is the creator as like a long time ago God created everything. That would be more to say God was the creator, right? But since God is beyond time, then God is the creator eternally. God is the creator because creation is not something that God did once and then stopped. But the fact that anything exists right now is because God is creating it to be. Like God is holding it in being. So let's go back to the sun is the radiance of God's glory, the exact representation of his being, sustaining all things. That's like active present tense, sustaining currently all things by his powerful word. So this is what we mean as God as creator. Not just that God, so like, one of the gods, Jupiter or Mars, we could say that one of them like made the earth and like set it and going and then went back to his home, right? And that even wouldn't be saying the same thing as God is the creator of everything. When we say God, the God of the Bible is the creator of everything, we don't mean that in a temporal sense because God transcends time, right? So we mean that God is the creator of everything always, all the time. St. Augustine said, "You are closer to me than my very own breath. I thought I didn't know you, but really what it was is I didn't know myself. Because you were in me the whole time." And so because God is transcendent, God can be close to each of us in an intimate, personal way without contradiction, because God permeates everything that exists. So understanding God's bigness doesn't make God far away. It actually brings God closer to us, in a sense. The other thing too is, even ancient philosophers, before they thought about the cosmos scientifically, they had this big debate about whether or not the universe was eternal. And so they were all Christians, and they were like, I don't know if the universe is eternal or if at one point the universe, something like the Big Bang happened. On both sides, they would say God is the creator. But because they thought of creation not as like a temporal act, but as like an eternal act by God, they would say whether or not there's a Big Bang, God is the creator of everything. Even if the universe itself was temporally eternal, in another sense, God was still the cause and that God was the creator. It just goes to show that they use the words like cause in a little bit different way than we do. We only think about material temporal causes, but they had from Aristotle, they had all these different, they had 5 different ways of talking about causality. It's really complicated, but anyway, that's totally not relevant. Trey, can you please bring the mic over to Deja? I think you had something you want to say?
Omnipresence and what we're talking about right now, are we saying it's not that God's when I think of omnipresence, usually I think of God running around everywhere to be everywhere, and then instead we're saying God's not like running around to be everywhere. He is everything everywhere.
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. No, that's really good. Like, some people really get hung up. Like, how can God? So I was going to read something, and maybe I'll do that right now. That's really similar to the question about like prayer. Like, how can God hear everybody's prayer at the same time? Is he running around listening to everyone's prayer? And this is like a really good way to get into what we mean when we say the word God, because these are the questions that come up, right? So let me read this to you real quick. So this is, I feel really cliche right now because I'm about to read C.S. Lewis to you all, so forgive me. I'm sorry. This part is really good, you know, okay? I feel like people like him for the wrong reasons a lot. Okay. So he says this, a man put it to me by saying, I can believe in God all right, but what I can't swallow is the idea of him attending to several 100 million human beings who are all addressing him at the same moment. And I found that quite a lot of people feel this. Well, the first thing to notice, this is his response to that question. Like, I believe in God, but I have a hard time believing that God is like listening. How could God do anything if he's constantly listening to everyone's prayers all the time? It seems really distracting, right? Well, first thing we have to notice is that the whole sting of it comes in the words, at the same moment. Most of us can imagine God attending to any number of people if only they came one by one, and he had an endless time in which to do it, right? So what's really at the back of this difficulty is the idea of God having to fit too many things into one moment of time. Well, that is, of course, what happens to us. Our life comes to us moment by moment. One moment disappears before the next one comes along. There's room for precious little in each. That's what time is like. And of course, you and I tend to take it for granted that this time series isn't simply the way life comes to us, but is the way things really are. We tend to assume that the whole universe and God himself are always moving on from past to future just like we do. But many learned people don't agree with that. That's a way to say it, I guess. It was the theologians who first started the idea that some things are not in time at all. Later, philosophers took it over, and now some scientists are doing the same thing. Almost certainly, God is not in time. His life does not consist of moments following one another in succession. If 1 million people are praying to God at 10:30 at night, he hasn't got to listen to them all in that little snippet which we call 10:30. 10:30 and every other moment from the beginning of the world is always the present for God. If you like to put it that way, he has all eternity in which to listen to the split-second prayer put up by a pilot as his plane crashes in flames. I think that's a beautiful image, right? God has eternity to listen to that prayer. It's difficult, I know. Let me try to give something not the same, but a little bit like it. So then he uses this analogy. He says, suppose I'm writing a novel, and I sit down and I write the words, Mary laid down her book. Next moment came a knock at the door. So for Mary, who has to live in this imaginary time that the author is creating, there's no interval between putting down the book and hearing the knock at the door. But the author, who's writing this, could write, Mary put down the book, and then the author could go get lunch, come back, and then write the next moment a knock at the door, right? So like, that's not a great analogy, but like, you know, it's just an analogy that God relates to time in a fundamentally different way than we do, such that the things that we think would be really hard would not be hard for God. And that's just like one kind of way to get at the idea of God's transcendence, is to think about one aspect. Think about time. So time can't relate to God the way that it relates to us. And just thinking about that, like, just really messes with my head, because it reminds me that I casually can use the word God. God did this, God did that, God thinks this, God likes this, God doesn't like that. And when I think about time like that, it really humbles me, and I think, oh, I have to remember, I really don't know what I'm talking about when I'm making pronouncements on behalf of God. It makes me want to be more humble, for sure. No, you're good. Now we're wiping the mic down now, so.
No, real quick. No, this is really good. I mean, but even when it comes to time, I think a lot of times when people are trying to And it's kind of finite. I mean, it's a losing battle to try to understand God outside of what He tells us.
Right.
You know, our intelligence is just can't match up with that. You know, but one of the things is a lot of times we fail in trying to understand God when we try to put Him in our world, in our vernacular,
right,
on our somewhere on our level, maybe just a little bit above us. You know,
right.
You know, and that's where we mess up. I mean, you got to remember. God is he's outside of time, and not only that, time exists in Him.
Yeah.
You know, like literally He created time. Time exists in Him. So God is not on a time schedule. God is literally it time bends to God because He's so out of it. He's not tripping. So when people are,
right.
Well, you can have all 7 billion people saying the same thing to God. We have to understand. Everything that we say, pray, do anything, God has already done before we prayed it. According to what He says.
When you said before, and that even is like capitulating to a bad metaphor, right? Because right, for God, right?
Yeah, and so I mean, just in our thinking, you know.
I know what you meant.
You know, and it's like long before we, you know, all those things come. He's already made provisions. He's already done what needed to be done. So people are literally, our lives are catching up. What we do in time is literally trying to catch up. Well, it can't catch up, but trying to catch up to what was already done in eternity.
Yeah.
You know, so when we try to ask those type of questions, we're trying to put God in that. In our zone, He exists totally outside of that zone.
Right.
It cannot be understood apart from what He reveals to us through His Word, like literally. You know, so it's like, you know, and then what He revealed to us on the other side when we get to heaven. You know, basically. You know, so I just think in those moments that just shows how vast and how powerful God is, because
absolutely.
He's so beyond us,
right? So
beyond us that. We have to honor that. We have to recognize that, you know, and not try to put God in it. But our goals, our human pride, our intellect, we got to put Him down. We got to bring Him down here. No, He exists totally outside of it, you know. And so I just think that's where we need to keep Him.
That's good. This is a great quote. It's not that eternity is the place that God lives. You could say this is the same thing with heaven. Just replace eternity with heaven here. That would also work. It's not that eternity is the place that God lives. God is the place that eternity lives. Right? Boom! That's deep.
A few things like, this feels like so beyond my brain right now. But some of the things that are like coming up for me is like a worship song that I love called He Has Time. And so the first thing I was thinking of was like, oh, so like God doesn't have to like wait for my prayer to come in the queue. Like He can just sit down and be like, all right, let's see what Deja wants to talk about, and like just like spend time with me, or like, I don't know. I'm trying to like put this, I still, with my brain's capacity, I'm trying to see what that relationally looks like with me and God. And it still feels like really intimate in that, like, at any moment of my life, God can decide to like spend it with me, and He has plenty of time.
Right, God is never too busy.
Yeah.
Right.
To just like, yeah. For me, it might feel like a pause for Him, but He always has that because He controls that.
Right. That's so good. Yeah, and all of this, I think like there is like application. I mean, the reason why we think about this stuff is for application. It's not just to have the, you know, philosophically correct view of God, but because the philosophically correct view of God like ends, it empties out into praise of God, and like true praise of God. If we have a lesser idea of God, it's going to be easier for us to try to think that we can manipulate God towards our own ends, use God as a means to an end. You know, like you can't have this theology and believe like in the prosperity gospel, you know, like it has to have a lesser God. Like bad theologies have to have a lesser God, because this God will not like submit to those get rich quick schemes or whatever. whatever kind of like task that we want to give for God to do for us, we have to, a God like this, we just have to say, not my will, but yours be done, you know? So, just like time, where is God? Does God live in heaven? Well, heaven is his throne and the earth is his footstool, so apparently not. Like, heaven is not the place where God lives. Like, I think we talked about this earlier, but heaven is a metaphor for the heavens, which are above us and beyond us. So then when we talk about heaven as God's space, that's not like, it doesn't mean that God lives in space. Like, heaven itself is the throne that God sits on, which means that God transcends that. Like, yeah, Jesus, let us have
I
it.
just want to say something. I don't know why, but have you guys ever seen The Matrix? Right? Remember when it says she tells what's her name? I know you know what I'm gonna do before I sit down and everything. But I just when we meet God, hey God, when I talk to you, you already know what I'm gonna tell you, right?
Yes.
It's like that, right? God already knows when you go meet him, he knows what you're gonna say, whatever. But I would say, well, I remember in The Matrix, he goes, I was gonna sit down already, right? But like it's kind of weird how when you go meet God, you gotta sit down and go, you know what I'm thinking, right? You know, right?
Yeah.
I have to share that.
Yeah. No, that's good. Thank you. So where is God, right? In him. I love all these verses that say, like, in him we live and move and have our being. Or that he's before all things, and in him all things hold together. Not just, like, because of him all things hold together. In him. And then it makes me think about this, right? It's not that eternity is where God lives, but God is the place that eternity lives. Here's another one. One Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of all, who is over all and through all and in all. That's like a really good definition of transcendence right there. All of this stuff is biblical. These are not just philosophers like making up categories. They're like making up categories to try to make sense technically of the things that the Bible is saying, like poetically and spiritually, you know? So sometimes people think philosophy and worship are sort of at odds with each other. One is like cold, and the other one is warm and thoughtful. But really, these are just two discourses trying to get at the same thing. And they have strengths and weaknesses. Here's another, oh man, I quoted C.S. Lewis twice. I'm so sorry. I love this quote. This is like this is from the Space Trilogy, which were like science fiction books. But this is another great example of his understanding of like classical Christian concepts of transcendence, right? All of him dwells within the seed of the smallest flower and is not cramped. At the same time, deep heaven is inside him who is inside the seed and does not distend him. Distend means like it doesn't like squish him or like whatever. Blessed is he. That's part of this poem that I think is really amazing. But yeah, I like that. Right before this, that poem says like the person that adds miles on top of miles or years on top of years or galaxies on top of galaxies does not approach God's greatness. And then it says, he dwells, all of him, within the seed of the smallest flower and is not cramped. So it's saying, like, when we think about God's bigness, we can't just, like, do addition. And if we add and add and add and add, then we get to God's bigness. God's bigness is a whole different kind of thing. God's bigness is the kind of thing that can dwell in the smallest thing. All of him at once. But also that all of heaven is inside him who is inside the smallest seed, you know? I think that's beautiful. So like I said, good theology eventually leads us to like using it for heartfelt poetry. And that's why I like it. Woo! That's the end of our slides. So yeah, we talked tonight about transcendence. We talked about God's relationship to time. Oh, I wish we could have gotten to the whole causality thing, but we kind of skipped it. But anyway, God is on a whole nother level, right? Check out this slide as we finish up. Next week, we're going to be talking about more about mediators. So this is about why God needs mediators. But next we're going to talk about how mediators work in Hebrews and in the Bible, and the misconceptions about them, I guess. So we're going to be talking about how does God overcome our sinfulness, our brokenness, our finitude, our inclination towards death, and all of these things, while also healing us and bringing us into relationship with God through a mediator that is Jesus, who is also God. So it's a little confusing. But thanks for being with us. Let me pray for us, and then we will finish up. And Lord, we confess that we can talk about you, but you dwell in an unapproachable light, and you cannot be comprehended or grasped by any one of our minds or the totality of all of our minds put together, Lord. And so, in light of that truth, we stand in awe of you, and we put ourselves at the mercy of your goodness, not because we know that we can't understand or control you, but we do at the same time trust that you are who you've told us you are, and that you are good, and that your mercy endures forever, and that you desire to be close to us, even though you are far beyond us. And so we thank you for your complicatedness, your utter mystery, and also your intimate friendship and personal presence, Lord. And even though we can't understand these things, we want to have the right language that doesn't put limits on you. We don't want to do disservice to you by speaking less of you than what is proper, Lord. And so help us to continue on this journey, but also remembering that we are not we're not transformed by abstract knowledge, but by really comprehending your goodness. And so continue to deepen our relationship with you, Lord. And we ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. Thank you all for being here. For the people who are on the stream, thank you. I will look at your comments and answer them soon. Choir practice is starting now, so if you can, I don't know if they want to sit around this table or what, but we'll clean up somehow. I know, where is everybody? Yeah, maybe we shouldn't, yeah.